was saying before I was interrupted. An assembly where, except for the small piping voice in front, there is complete stillness. The hour is much too grave for us to waste it in chatter. A relationship of this kind, of course, would never content Josephine. Despite all the nervous uneasiness that fills Josephine because of her position has never been quite defined. Because her position has never been quite defined, there is still much that she does not see, blinded by her self-conceit, and she can be brought fairly easily to overlook much more. A swarm of flatterers is always busy about her to this end, thus really doing a public service, and yet to be only an incidental, unnoticed performer in a corner of an assembly of the people. For that, although in itself would be no small thing, she would certainly not make us the sacrifice of her singing. Nor does she need to, for her art does not go unnoticed, although we are at bottom preoccupied with quite other things, and it is by no means only for the sake of her singing that stillness prevails, and many a listener does not even look up, but buries his face in his neighbor's fur, so that Josephine up in front seems to be exerting herself to no purpose. There is yet something, it cannot be defined, that irresistibly makes its way into us from Josephine's piping, this piping, which rises up where everyone else is pledged to silence, comes almost like a message from the whole people to each individual. Josephine's thin piping amidst grave decisions is almost like our people's precarious existence amidst the tumult of a hostile world. Josephine exerts herself, a mere nothing in voice, a mere nothing in execution. She asserts herself and gets across to us. It does us good to think of that. A really trained singer, if ever such a one should be found among us, we could certainly not endure at such a time, and we should unanimously turn away from the senselessness of any such performance. May Josephine be spared from perceiving that the mere fact of our listening to her is proof that she is no singer. An intuition of it she must have, else why does she so passionately deny that we do listen? Only she keeps on singing and piping her intuition away. But there are other things she could take comfort from. We do really listen to her, in a sense, probably much as one listens to a trained singer. She gets effects which a trained singer would try in vain to achieve among us, and which are only produced precisely because her means are so inadequate. For this, doubtless, our way of life is mainly responsible. Among our people there is no age of youth, scarcely the briefest childhood. Regularly, it is true, demands are put forward that the children should be granted a special freedom, a special protection, that their right to be a little carefree, to have a little senseless giddiness, a little play, that this right should be respected and the exercise of it encouraged. Such demands are put forward, and nearly everyone approves them. There is nothing one could approve more, but there is also nothing in the reality of our daily life that is less likely to be granted. One approves these demands, one makes attempts to meet them, but soon all the old ways are back again. Our life happens to be such that a child, as soon as it can run about a little, and a little distinguish one thing from another, must look after itself just like an adult. The areas on which, for economic reasons, we have to live in dispersion are too wide, our enemies too numerous, the dangers lying everywhere in wait for us too incalculable. We cannot shelter our children from the struggle for existence. If we did so, it would bring them to an early grave. These depressing considerations are reinforced by another, which is not depressing, the fertility of our race, our generation, one generation, and each is numerous, treads on the heels of another. The children have no time to be children. Our other races may foster their children carefully. Schools may be erected for their little ones. Out of these schools the children may come pouring daily, the future of the race. Yet among them it is always the same children that come out day after day for a long time. We have no schools, but from our race come pouring at the briefest intervals the innumerable swarms of our children, merrily lisping or chirping so long as they cannot yet pipe, rolling or tumbling along by sheer impetus so long as they cannot yet run, clumsily carrying everything before them by mass weight so long as they cannot yet see. Our children, and not the same children as in those schools, no, always new children, again and again, without end, without a break. Hardly does a child appear, then it is no more a child, while behind it, a new childish face, already crowding so fast and so thick that they are indistinguishable, rosy with happiness. Truly, however delightful this may be, and however much others may envy us for it, and rightly, we simply cannot give a real childhood to our children, and that has its consequences. A kind of unexpected, ineradicable childishness pervades our people. In direct opposition to what is best in us, our infallible, practical common sense, we often behave with the utmost foolishness, with exactly the same foolishness as children, senselessly, wastefully, grandiosely, irresponsibly, and all that often for the sake of some trivial amusement. And although our enjoyment of it cannot, of course, be so wholehearted as a child's enjoyment, something of this survives in it, without a doubt. From this childishness of our people, Josephine, too, has profited since the beginning. Yet our people are not only childish, we are also, in a sense, prematurely old. Childhood and age come upon us not as upon others. We have no youth. We are all at once grown up, and then we stay grown up too long, a certain weariness and hopelessness spreading from that leaves a broad trail through our people's nature. A weariness and hopelessness spreading from that leaves a broad trail through our people's nature, tough and strong in hope, that is, in general. Our lack of musical gifts has surely some connection with this. We are too old for music. Its excitement, its rapture do not suit our heaviness. Wearily we wave it away. We content ourselves with piping. A little piping here and there, that is enough for us. Who knows? There may be talents for music among us, but if there were, the character of our people would suppress them before they could unfold. Josephine, on the other hand, can pipe as much as she will, or sing, or whatever she likes to call it. That does not disturb us. That suits us. That we can well put up with. Any music there may be in its reduced to the least possible trace. A certain tradition of music is preserved, yet without making the slightest demand upon us. But our people, being what they are, get still more than this from Josephine. At her concerts, especially in times of stress, it is only the very young who are interested in her singing as singing. They alone gaze in astonishment as she purses her lips, expels the air between her pretty front teeth, swoons in sheer wonderment at the sounds she herself is producing, and after such a lying away, swells her performance to new and more incredible heights, whereas the real mass of the people, this is plain to see, are quite withdrawn into themselves. Here, in the brief intervals between their struggles, our people dream. It is as if the limbs of each were loosened, as if they harried individual once in a while, at least, as if the harried individual once in a while could relax and stretch himself at ease in the great warm bed of the community. And into these dreams Josephine's piping drops note by note. She calls it pearl-like. We call it staccato. But at any rate, here it is in its right place, as nowhere else, finding the moment, wait for it, as music scarcely ever does. Something of our poor brief childhood is in it. Something of lost happiness that can never be found again, but also something of active daily life, of its small gaieties, unaccountable, and yet springing up, and not to be obliterated. And indeed, this is all expressed not in full round tones, but softly, in whispers, confidentially, and sometimes a little hoarsely. Of course, it is a kind of piping. Why not? Piping is our people's daily speech. Only many a one pipes his whole life long, and does not know it. Where here piping is act free from the fetters of daily life, and it sets us free too for a little while, we certainly should not want to do without these performances. But from that point, it is a long, long way to Josephine's claim that she gives us new strength, and so on and so forth, for ordinary people at least, not for her train of flatterers. What other explanation could there be, they say with quite shameless sauciness. How else could you explain the great audiences, especially when danger is most imminent, which have even often enough hindered proper precautions being taken in time to avert danger. Now, this last statement is unfortunately true, but can hardly be counted as one of Josephine's titles to fame, especially considering that when such large gatherings have been unexpectedly flushed by the enemy and many of our people left lying for dead, Josephine, who was responsible for it all, and indeed perhaps attracted the enemy by her piping, has always occupied the safest place, and was always the first to whisk away quietly and speedily under cover of her escort. Still, everyone really knows that, and yet people keep running to whatever place Josephine decides on next. At whatever time she rises up to sing, one could argue from this that Josephine stands almost beyond the law, that she can do what she pleases, at the risk of actually endangering the community, and will be forgiven for everything. If this were so, even Josephine's claims would be entirely comprehensible. Yes, in this freedom to be allowed her, this extraordinary gift granted to her and to no one else in direct contravention of the laws, one could see an admission of the fact that the people do not understand Josephine, just as she alleges that they marvel helplessly at her art, feel themselves unworthy of it, try to assuage the pity she rouses in them by making really desperate sacrifices for her, and to the same extent that her art is beyond their comprehension, consider her personality and her wishes to lie beyond their jurisdiction. Well, that is simply not true at all. Perhaps as individuals, the people may surrender too easily to Josephine, but as a whole, they surrender unconditionally to no one, and not to her either. For a long time back, perhaps since the very beginning of her artistic career, Josephine has been fighting for exemption from all daily work on account of her singing. She should be relieved of all responsibility for earning her daily bread and being involved in the general struggle for existence, which apparently should be transferred on her behalf to the people as a whole. A facile enthusiast, and there have been such, might argue from the mere unusualness of this demand, from the spiritual attitude needed to frame such a demand, that it has an inner justification. But our people draw other conclusions and quietly refuse it, nor do they trouble much about disproving the assumptions on which it is based. Josephine argues, for instance, that the strain of working is bad for her voice, that the strain of working is, of course, nothing to the strain of singing, but it prevents her from being able to rest sufficiently after singing and to recuperate for more singing, and has to exhaust her strength completely, and yet, in these circumstances, can never rise to the peak of her abilities. The people listen to her arguments and pay no attention. Our people, so easily moved, sometimes cannot be moved at all. Their refusal is sometimes so decided that even Josephine is taken aback. She appears to submit, does her proper share of work, sings as best she can, but only for a time. Then with renewed strength, for this purpose her strength seems inexhaustible, she takes up the fight again. Now, it is clear that what Josephine really wants is not what she puts into words. She is honorable. She is not work-shy, shirking in any case quite unknown among us. If her petition were granted, she would certainly live the same life as before. Her work would not at all get in the way of her singing, nor would her singing grow any better. What she wants is public, unambiguous, permanent recognition of her art, going far beyond any precedent so far known. But while almost everything else seems within her reach, this eludes her persistently. Perhaps she should have taken a different line of attack from the beginning. Perhaps she herself sees that her approach was wrong, but now she cannot draw back. Retreat would be self-betrayal. Now she must stand or fall by her petition. If she really had enemies, as she avers, they could get much amusement from watching this struggle without having to lift a finger. But she has no enemies, and even though she is often criticized here and there, no one finds this struggle of hers amusing, just because of the fact that the people show themselves here in their cold, judicial aspect, which is otherwise rarely seen among us. And however one may approve it, in this case, the very idea that such an aspect might be turned upon oneself some day prevents amusement from breaking in. The important thing, both in the people's refusal and in Josephine's petition, the important thing, both in people's refusal and in Josephine's petition, is not the action itself, but the fact that the people are capable of presenting a stony, impenetrable front to one of their own, and that is all the more impenetrable because in other respects they show an anxious paternal care, and more than paternal care, for this member of the people. And more than paternal care. You know what I'm saying? Suppose that instead of the people one had an individual to deal with. One might imagine that this man had been giving in to Josephine all the time while nursing a wild desire to put an end to his submissiveness one fine day, that he had made superhuman sacrifices for Josephine in the firm belief that there was a natural limit to his capacity for sacrifice, yes, that he had sacrificed more than was needful, merely to hasten the process, merely to spoil Josephine and encourage her to ask for more and more until she did indeed reach the limit with this last petition of hers, and that he cut her off with a final refusal, which was curt because so long held in reserve. Now, this is certainly not how the matter stands. The people have no need of such guile. Besides, their respect for Josephine is well tried and genuine, and Josephine's demands are, after all, so far-reaching that any simple child could have told her what the outcome would be. Yet it may be that such considerations enter into Josephine's way of taking the matter, and so add a certain bitterness to the pain of being refused. But whatever her ideas on the subject, she does not let them deter her from pursuing the campaign. Recently, she has even intensified her attack. Hitherto, she has used only words as her weapon, but now she is beginning to have recourse to other means, which she thinks will prove more efficacious, but which we think will run her into greater dangers. Many believe that Josephine is becoming so insistent because she feels herself growing old and her voice falling off, and so she thinks it high time to wage the last battle for recognition. I do not believe it. Josephine would not be Josephine if that were true, for there is no growing old and no falling off in her voice. If she makes demands, it is not because of outward circumstances, but because of an inner logic. She reaches for the highest garland, not because it is momentarily hanging a little lower, but because it is the highest. If she had any say in the matter, she would have it still higher. This contempt for her external difficulties, to be sure, does not hinder her from using the most unworthy methods. Her rights seem beyond question to her. So what does it matter how she secures them, especially since in this world, as she sees it, honest methods are bound to fail. Perhaps that is why she has transferred the battle for her rights from the field of song to another, which she cares little about. Her supporters have let it be known that, according to herself, she feels quite capable of singing in such a way that all levels of the populace, even to the remotest corners of the opposition, would find it a real delight, not by popular standards, for the people affirm that they have always delighted in her singing, but a delight by her own standards. However, she adds, since she cannot falsify the highest standards, nor pander to the lowest, her singing will have to stay as it is. But when it comes to her campaign for exemption from work, we get a different story. It is, of course, also a campaign on behalf of her singing, yet she is not fighting directly with the priceless weapon of her song, so any instrument she uses is good enough. Thus, for instance, the rumor went round that Josephine meant to cut short her grace notes if her petition were not granted. I know nothing about the grace notes, and have never noticed any in Josephine singing, but Josephine is going to cut short her grace notes. Not, for the present, to cut them out entirely, only to cut them short. Presumably, she has carried out her threat, although I, for one, have observed no difference in her performance. The people as a whole listened in the usual way, without making any pronouncement on the grace notes, nor did their response to her petition vary by a jot. It must be admitted that Josephine's way of thinking, like her figure, is often very charming. And so, for instance, after that performance, just as if her decision about the grace notes had been too severe or too sudden a move against the people, she announced that next time she would put in all the grace notes again. Yet after the next concert, she changed her mind again. Once more, there was to be definitely an end of these great arias with the grace notes, and until her petition was favorably regarded, they would never recur. Well, the people let all these announcements, decisions, and counter-decisions go in at one ear and out at the other, like a grown-up person deep in thought, turning a deaf ear to a child's babble. Fundamentally, well-disposed, but not accessible. Josephine, however, does not give in. The other day, for instance, she claimed that she had hurt her foot at work, so that it was difficult for her to stand up to sing. But since she could not sing except standing up, her songs would now have to be cut short. Although she limps and leans on her supporters, no one believes that she is really hurt. Granted that her frail body is extra sensitive, she is yet one of us, And we are a race of workers. If we were to start limping every time we got a scratch, the whole people would never be done limping. Yet, though she lets herself be led about like a cripple, though she shows herself in this pathetic condition oftener than usual, the people all the same listen to her singing thankfully and appreciatively as before, but do not bother much about the shortening of her songs. Since she cannot very well go on limping forever, she thinks of something else. She pleads that she is tired, not in the mood for singing, feeling faint. And so we get a theatrical performance as well as a concert. We see Josephine's supporters in the background begging and imploring her to sing. She would be glad to oblige, but she cannot. They comfort and caress her with flatteries. They almost carry her to the selected spot where she is supposed to sing. At last, bursting inexplicably into tears, she gives way. But when she stands up to sing, obviously at the end of her resources, weary, her arms not widespread as usual, but hanging lifelessly down, so that one gets the impression that they are perhaps a little too short. Just as she is about to strike up, there, she cannot do it after all. An unwilling shake of the head tells us so, and she breaks down before our eyes. To be sure, she pulls herself together again and sings, I fancy, much as usual. Perhaps, if one has an ear for the finer shades of expression, one can hear that she is singing with unusual feeling, which is, however, all to the good. And in the end, she is actually less tired than before. With a firm tread, if one can use such a term for her tripping gait, she moves off, refusing all help from her supporters and measuring with cold eyes the crowd which respectfully makes way for her. That happened a day or two ago, but the latest is that she has disappeared, just at a time when she was supposed to sing. It is not only her supporters who are looking for her. Many are devoting themselves to the search, but all in vain. Josephine has vanished. She will not sing. She will not even be cajoled into singing. This time she has deserted us entirely. Curious how mistaken she is in her calculations. The clever creature, so mistaken that one might fancy she has made no calculations at all, but is only being driven on by her destiny, which in our world cannot be anything but a sad one. Of her own accord she abandons her singing. Of her own accord she destroys the power she has gained over people's hearts. How could she ever have gained that power, since she knows so little about these hearts of ours? She hides herself, and does not sing, but our people, quietly, without visible disappointment, a self-confident mass in perfect equilibrium, so constituted, even although appearances are misleading, that they can only bestow gifts and not receive them, even from Josephine. Our people continue on their way. Josephine's road, however, must go downhill. The time will soon come when her last notes sound and die into silence. She is a small episode in the eternal history of our people, and the people will get over the loss of her. Not that it will be easy for us. How can our gatherings take place in utter silence? Still, were they not silent even when Josephine was present? Was her actual piping notably louder and more alive than the memory of it will be? Was it even in her lifetime more than a simple memory? Was it not rather because Josephine's singing was already past losing in this way that our people in their wisdom prized it so highly? So perhaps we shall not miss so very much after all, while Josephine, redeemed from the earthly sorrows which to her thinking lay in wait for all chosen spirits, will happily lose herself in the numberless throng of the heroes of our people, and soon, since we are no historians, will rise to the heights of redemption and be forgotten, like all her brothers. That was Josephine the Singer, or The Mousefolk. Another selected story of Franz Kafka. Now, I started in the middle of this book of selected stories by Franz Kafka with a story called A Collective Confusion, I believe. Where did it go? I shall not find it. But I'd like to read the first half of it too. I keep forgetting the camera's up there now. Got a new webcam. I can do fun stuff like make it black and white. How cool is that? So stay tuned for more short stories in the future. I'm enjoying reading them, and someday it'll be important.